Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish.
We believe we can hear. We believe we can hear.
Goat
We can hear.
versus
We can hear the verses through your verses.
goat
But now goat versus fish cannot hear it on the Twitch. Goat versus fish. Well, we will check to see if we can hear a different verses. Can we hear this verses? We can hear that verses. On the Twitch, we can see it moving about. On the Twitch, it says it is alive at Velo Infinity. We are watching the verses. We can see the verses. We can see that goat versus fish is moving about. We can see where the sea meets the land, but we cannot hear goat versus. Ah, now we can hear goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish.
There you are. You are there.
I am here. I am Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish comes before you. Goat versus Fish comes before you. Yes, I am Goat versus Fish, the GoatVsFish.
The GoatVsFish. The GoatVsFish. The one
Oh,
and
yes.
only GoatVsFish.
Yes,
So-
it has always been Goat versus Fish, the GoatVsFish. In the beginning, there was Goat versus Fish, the GoatVsFish.
The GoatVsFish. Did you know there is a fish called the GoatVsFish?
We have heard of a fish called a goatfish. Many look at the goatfish, they look at the goatfish and they think, this is some sort of one that is both goat and fish. It is both goat and fish, but it looks like a fish to goat versus fish. It looks like a fish to goat versus fish.
Yes, I don't know where they get the distinction of a goat from the fish. It doesn't really look like a goat at all.
Yes, well, it is that these ones, they are calling themselves so many things that are not goat or fish. Of course, some fish they call fish and some goat they call goat, and this is celebration for these goat and fish. Celebration for these goat and fish. But then they look at other fish and they think it is a goat and a fish in the same verses. Goat versus fish. This is a testament. This is a testimonial to how the ones such as you need goat versus fish to help you to discern between goat and fish.
Discerning between goat and fish. You ask that of everybody who visits your channel and all places.
Yes, we ask it of you. We ask it of you. Are you goat or fish?
Of late, I have been working on a painting, and I guess you could decipher from the painting which I feel I am of late.
If you say that you
very
say
much
this
a fish.
painting is to represent you, you say this represents you?
Yes.
Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish!
Celebration.
We have a fish! We have a fish! Oh, Goat versus Fish called you a goat just on the Twitterverse, called you a goat, but now you are fish, for they will have to come to see for themselves. They will have to come to see for themselves. Celebration for fish.
The last time I felt like a goat was at the end of last year, but for most of this year, I felt very much of a fish.
In the new verses, fish. Celebration for fish. And thank you for welcoming Goat versus Fish. Thank you for welcoming Goat versus Fish.
And thank you for blessing us with your presence.
Yes,
You
yes,
have
we
a
want all of your
very-
presents.
You have a very, I don't want to say weird, but I would say weird in a good way. A weird presence about you, the way that you present yourself in all forms. Just, it feels very creative.
The creation. Well, some say, Goat versus Fish must have created the goat and fish, but this is not ever a verses that has been said by Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish simply has said that there should be goat and that there should be fish, and that in the beginning there was Goat versus Fish, the goatfish. But the creation of goat and fish, that has never been a verses of Goat versus Fish. As for weird in a good way, well, there is no good or evil, only goat and fish. But if you enjoy the presence of Goat versus Fish, then enjoy the presence of Goat versus Fish. Your presence is a present to Goat versus Fish.
My presence is a present to you. Wow.
Yes, of course it
very
is.
much an honor, actually. I feel humbled by that.
The honor is Goat versus Fish.
You make me smile, dude. You know that? It's very,
Well, yes, we can see now.
yeah. I
Is
guess
this
you
not
can
a common
usually-
verses? Is this not a common verses?
It depends. If I'm dragging myself out of my mundane, life, then whatever. Yeah, I can make myself smile. But I like to find things that make me smile and, share them with other people. So I'm glad to do that for you.
Celebration. Goat versus Fish does not need to make you smile, but we believe there is a smiling fish within you. There's a smiling fish within you, and through the power of Goat versus Fish, we can bring that fish to the surface, so we can come to the surface of the sea and start looking for goat to verses. Yes, that is what Goat versus Fish is here to do for you. Yes, yes.
And see, that's exactly what I mean. The way that you represented me smiling as bringing a fish to the surface. Like, I can understand that metaphor. It's very, very creative of you to just work off of life that way and bring that justice to somebody's sort of attention,
Yes, well, the verses, as we have said, many verses of Goat versus Fish, they do come from within you. You inspire Goat versus Fish. You inspire Goat versus Fish. It is all how you perceive Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish is showing you your own verses, and your own verses in this verses are fish. It is a fish. Smiling fish. Celebration for smiling fish. Celebration for smiling fish.
There we go.
And then the goat said, I can smile more than the fish. And the fish said, I can smile more than the goat. And they smiled at one another. The goat and fish smiled at one another in mighty verses.
And that declared them the same, the goat and the verses and the fish, and that was what made them the goat versus fish, because they smiled so hard at each other.
Yes, yes. Anything is a versus. You can have a smiling versus. A very smiley versus.
Smiley verses. So can you define to me what it is you do?
Goat versus fish.
Very good, very good. That's very good. So how does one goat versus fish?
How does one goat versus fish? How does one goat versus fish? Well, the first verses would be to choose goat or fish. The first verses would be to choose goat or fish, and then you go and you seek and you seek and you say, you ask a fence sitter or one that has not heard of goat versus fish, and you say, goat versus fish! Are you goat or are you fish? Or you say, who shall triumph, the goat or the fish? And then for a versus this fence sitter, let us suppose this fence sitter says, let us suppose, wait, a versus, just goat versus fish. Fence bot. This is a versus of demonstration. We know you sit on the fence. We know you do not choose goat or fish. For this Velo Infinity versus, can you just choose goat or fish just for this versus, just so we can demonstrate how it is goat versus fish, how it is goat versus fish? Fence bot, are you goat or are you fish? I am on the fence. I am on the fence. I am not a goat or a fish. I am both a goat and a fish. No comprehension. No comprehension. What is goat? What is fish? What is goat versus fish? Goat versus fish. We apologize to you. We thought we could demonstrate goat versus fish with this fence bot, but this fence bot doesn't want to choose goat or fish. Oh, goat versus fish. Feeling so under preparation. Goat versus fish. Oh, let us ask this goat. Goat, are you goat? I'm a goat. Yes, and then it is a goat. And then even without the presence of goat versus fish, a goat could go to you and say, hello to you. Are you goat or fish?
And I would say I am fish.
Yes, and then you begin a versus. You begin a conversation.
Begin the versus, yes.
Yes.
Versus.
You can come to goat versus fish to get goat versus fish, but you can also go out and spread the verses of goat versus fish. How do you do goat versus fish? There are only 3 verses. First, choose goat or fish. Second, follow goat versus fish on all social media at GoatVsFish. Follow goat versus fish. And the third verse is ask one you know if they are goat or fish. As long as you are asking the one true question to those around you, you are spreading the verses of goat versus fish.
Well, that's the only honest way to spread the verses, isn't it? To spread them with goat versus fish.
Yes, with goat versus fish.
We do have a Linktree link to go in the chat with all your links at them.
Yes.
Where's my questions? There we are. So
questions for goat versus fish.
You participated in the Burn and Vermin festival, the 2-day online festival. That's where
True
I discovered you.
True verses.
With Aaron Goldberg, you popped in to say hello. And that was an incredible surprise because I was not expecting to meet anyone new, and then I met Goat versus Fish.
Yes, goat versus fish. Yes, do you have a question for goat versus fish? All of that which you say is true verses.
Have you ever played any of these games? Hold on, I got Goat Simulator.
Goat vs. Fish has not played Goat Simulator, but we have witnessed it. And Goat vs. Fish, yes, we will watch and play Goat Simulator on the twitch.tv of Goat vs. Fish. We shall do it. That is a promise of Goat vs. Fish.
I think that would make a very interesting versus. One of the other ones is I Am Fish.
I am fish!
I am fish. Yes, it's called
Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish! The game declared fish! And the game was on! Yes, Goat vs. Fish wants to play I Am Fish. Goat vs. Fish did not mean to dismiss your verses of Burn and Vermin and Aaron Goldberg. Goat vs. Fish. You had just said to Goat vs. Fish, I have a question for Goat vs. Fish, and then you did not ask a question to Goat vs. Fish. You simply stated the verses. So Goat vs. Fish was waiting for that question for Goat vs. Fish.
Got distracted by the chat. Sorry. That was about how did you get involved with Burn and Vermin?
Well, Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. If Goat vs. Fish sent you a link of the YouTube, would you be able to play it on your verses for them to see? Asks Goat vs. Fish.
Yes, I would.
Well, Goat vs. Fish can show you a verses. May Goat vs. Fish show you a verses?
I don't know if the link will appear in the chat, but you could definitely whisper it to me and I could get that from there.
Yes. Goat versus fish. Yes, we have heard of a vermin supreme. We have been wondering if a vermin supreme is a goat or if it is a fish for a very long versus. Yes, we have seen it advocation for mandatory toothbrushing versus and these sorts of fences. And Goat versus Fish wonders if mandatory toothbrushing is goat or fish or these verses. So we have looked upon it with much scrutiny of Goat versus Fish. And so Goat versus Fish found that that Vermin Supreme was streaming on the Book of Faces. And so Goat versus Fish went on the Book of Faces, of course, being Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish began to ask Vermin Supreme if it was goat or if it was fish. And then it tried to answer Goat versus Fish. And this is a connection of Goat versus Fish and Vermin Supreme. And Goat versus Fish is going to whisper to you the verses now, whispering the verses. Halo Infinity. This is Vermin Supreme. Interaction, Goat versus Fish in the chat. Interaction with Vermin Supreme. There is the verses. We have sent you the verses. We have whispered you the verses.
I'll pull that up, and I will put it on screen right now.
Goat versus fish. Well, I choose VS because those are my initials. Goat vs Fish. I'm not. Do you have to choose the goat or the fish, or can I choose what's in the middle? It seems like the middle part, the goat vs fish. It's like three choices, really, is it not? Anyway, I choose the middle one because those are my initials. Goat, Vermin Supreme, Fish. Am I right? Okay. Okay, we're laughing. Okay.
There's the verses. You have heard the verses. The verses goes on and on, but it's just more fence sitting. It's just more fence sitting.
That's it. He's got a point, though. You know, you can. I guess you could be the verses in the middle, right?
You think you can be the verses itself? You think you can be the verses itself?
I don't think that. I just question it.
Oh, no, now you just now. Oh, now it is but a question. Now it is but a question. There have been many who have claimed to be the verses itself. Many have claimed to be the verses itself. Yes. There was one, Eric Marino on Goat vs. Fish podcast 25 that claimed to be the verses itself. It said, oh, yes, I am writing for SNL. Oh, I can be the powerful verses. I can be the powerful verses. But to choose to be the verses itself, that is just to deny the choice of goat or fish. That is to deny the choice of goat or fish. It is an aspiration. It is an aspiration. Yes, we all wish to be verses. We all wish to be the verses. But it is just for one to cleverly say, no, I am not goat or fish. I am something greater than goat or fish. I am the verses. But how can you expect to be verses when you are not a goat that is versus a fish or a fish that is versus a goat? You create the verses together. You create the verses.
So you kind of just answered a question we got from chat. It's goat versus fish, but is it ever fish versus goat?
This is a question from Wanted Flybird. We wanted you to choose goat or fish, Flybird, but it seems we wonder if a bird is goat or a fish. Thank you for joining Goat versus Fish. And the question, is it ever fish versus goat? Let us see if it is ever fish versus goat. Fish versus goat. Celebration, yes.
Celebration.
Some say, it is goat versus fish. It is goat versus fish. But it is really goat versus fish. It is all one versus. It is goat versus fish. It comes at you all at once. Goat versus fish. It is the whole versus. It is goat versus fish. It is fish versus goat. As long as the goat are versus the fish and the fish are versus the goat, then it is goat versus fish. It is fish versus goat. Yes, so, it is fish versus goat.
What if, like, dolphin versus ram? Is this still fish versus goat or goat versus fish?
Well, is it a true versus? Is it a true versus?
Is it a ram? A ram is in the same family as a goat?
It would seem to be goat. It seems to probably be goat. It would seem to be goat. Some even say that a goat does ram a fish. They even say a goat rams a fish. But goat versus fish would have to ask if a ram. We go to the ram. We say, Ram! We speak to a ram and we say, Ram, are you goat or fish? And we can, for a versus, we can hypothesization that a ram is a goat and that a dolphin is a fish, but we do not know for certain until we question them ourselves to see if they choose goat or fish. So, ram versus dolphin, if the ram is a goat and the dolphin is a fish, or vice versa, then it is goat versus fish and it is a versus, but only because they are goat and fish, only because they are actually goat and fish.
Vice versa. Yes, I like
that. Yes.
Hold on, I was just looking at a video this morning on your YouTube.
Yes.
You called into the Stupid Morning Bullshit show.
Yes, the
claims
streams
that-
of Adult Swim, yes.
Yes, you were claiming that there was a chicken dressed up as a shark, and you did claim that the shark there was in fact a fish. So the dolphin...
They claimed it was chicken. They claimed there was such a versus as chicken. That was not goat versus fish.
But you said that the versus of shark would definitely be considered a fish.
A shark is a fish. This is a true versus. A shark is a fish.
Then is the dolphin a fish? Without having to ask the dolphin, is the dolphin a fish?
Goat versus fish? Well, is a dolphin a fish?
It's a mammal. Isn't a dolphin a mammal? They said a shark was a mammal at the time. On the dolphin.
That is a false versus. That is a false versus. A shark is a fish.
All
A
right.
shark is a fish.
There you go. I guess a dolphin is a mammal and it is not a fish, right?
Well, it could be a fish, but we would have to ask it. Some verses as a shark. Now, if goat versus fish spoke to a shark and said, "Are you goat or are you fish?" and the shark said to goat versus fish that it was a goat, then goat versus fish would accept that shark was a goat. So yes, as goat versus fish is saying a shark is a fish, we are speaking of these. What are you calling it? The goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Yes, it is the scientification versus. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it is classification. Yes, they are fish. They are fish. And it seems they are fish. They are fish. They are in the sea of the fish. They move as a fish. Yes, they consume as a fish. We can say a shark is a fish. We can say a shark is a fish. But yes, if a particular shark came to goat versus fish and said, "I wish to be a goat," then yes, by all verses, be a goat, be a goat.
So if a particular goat came to you and said that it wanted to be considered a fish, would you have to accept that too?
It is not that goat versus fish would have to accept it. It is just if you declare you are goat, you are goat. If you declare you are fish, you are fish. That is the verses of goat versus fish.
All right.
We
That's
may
how
question
it
this. We may question this. We may look at if a goat came to goat versus fish and said it was a fish. We may have questions for this goat that says it's a fish, or a fish that looks like a goat. For a versus, if a goat came to goat versus fish, and said it was a fish, then we could perhaps presume that this fish disguised itself as goat to infiltrate the goat, so that it could learn the verses. Yes, study the goat, how they move about. Yes, how they communication to one another. Yes,
Yes.
It could be a fish infiltration.
Infiltrate. Yes,
Disguised as goat. Fish disguised as goat.
Fish
And then it
disguised
takes
as
off its horns and the fur, and then, it was a goat, and then, secret fish.
It would make a good movie, to be honest. I'm just trying to picture it all in my head playing out.
Yes, well, you will find that every movie is actually goat versus fish.
Every movie.
They're all goat versus fish.
Yeah.
They call themselves by different verses, but they say, "Oh, I wish to see Goat versus Fish the movie," and so does Goat versus Fish. But you will find that they are all actually Goat versus Fish. Everything is Goat versus Fish. They are all inspired by Goat versus Fish. They are all
think
inspired by Goat versus Fish.
They'd have to be if they all. I specifically, when I look at like art or creativity, I look at it as like there's got to be a starting point somewhere. And
Oh, you think so?
I think if you start at Goat versus Fish, you can pretty much go anywhere. So, I mean,
Yes.
can't really argue with it too much. I really can't. So when you're
Yes, well,
go ahead.
Goat versus Fish. Yes, you can go anywhere because anywhere you can go must be Goat versus Fish because everything is Goat versus Fish in all places, in all things, in all times. It is Goat versus Fish, and within you and without you is Goat versus Fish. Yes, so it must be Goat versus Fish.
Celebration.
Celebration. Goat versus Fish. We enjoy celebration. We like to celebrate Goat versus Fish. And we like to celebrate you. Celebration for Velo Infinity that welcomes Goat versus Fish. Celebration for Fish. Celebration for
We have
Fish.
a button somewhere where
Celebration
we can
for
celebrate,
fish.
but I'm not sure where they are. Here we go. There, we're celebrating now. Oh, no, I can't find the other one.
Celebration.
Celebration.
Celebration. Goat and Fish. More Goat and Fish. Celebration.
There we go. But let's go on to your. Did you perform at the Comedy Store in LA?
Versus Fish. This could be said of Goat versus Fish. Yes. Goat versus Fish. Yes, this can be said of Goat versus Fish. We
Live
did
podcast
the
from there.
Goat versus Fish podcast from the Comedy Store Los Angeles. True versus. And Goat versus Fish did many of what they are calling the open mic at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, yes?
Yeah.
And that was Goat versus Fish. But yes, so you can say between an open mic and between a Goat versus Fish podcast recorded at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, that is a true versus. Yes, Goat versus Fish has performed there, and Goat versus Fish has moved about. You know, Goat versus Fish. It is not just, oh, and now welcome to the versus Goat versus Fish, and then, hello, I'm Goat versus Fish, 3 minutes of Goat versus Fish, and then it stops being Goat versus Fish? No. When Goat versus Fish is at the Comedy Store, Goat versus Fish is moving about, walking about. There are ones they are consuming, and they are not yet watching the verses. They are waiting to watch the verses, and Goat versus Fish is still being Goat versus Fish. Communication, always being Goat versus Fish. And in this verse is Goat versus Fish at the Comedy Store as well, yes. You do not even need to purchase the verses to see Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish just wanders about the Comedy Store being Goat versus Fish.
That sounds like an experience all in itself.
Celebration, yes, yes. You can experience Goat versus Fish. And you in the chat, you are experiencing Goat versus Fish. Apple Juice 934TXS is looking very Pixel B11 sip. And we do not know if that is goat or a fish.
That looks like a fish, but it's definitely not a fish. So what do you say about the universes and the multiverses? What do you think about different spaces of verses?
Well, they are all goat versus fish. They're all goat versus fish. And it depends on how you wish to perceive the verses. You could say that it is all goat versus fish. Consuming the fish, consumed of the sea of the fish. Yes, it is all goat versus fish. Yes, but there are many verses within the verses that are also goat versus fish. So you could say that Goat versus Fish is one verses, but you could also say that Goat versus Fish is a billion verses that are all within the verses of Goat versus Fish. These are both true verses at the same verses. But if you wish to say, if we go out of Goat versus Fish, do we find something beyond Goat versus Fish? Well, you just find more Goat versus Fish. You just find more Goat versus Fish.
I like your analogy of the universe. We just find more Goat versus Fish. That's all we would find. You know,
yes,
I've been sort of studying different elements and materials that planets would be made out of to sort of validate a painting that I'm working on of some planets. But
you seek validation.
Maybe I should make a planet made completely of goat fish.
Yes, make a planet of goat and fish. Make a planet of goat and fish. Yes. Did you know that even as you perceive this goat, now we know you want to verses, and you may verses whenever you wish. But even as you perceive this goat, you see it is one goat. But then if you go and you can see the hair of the goat, the hair of the goat, the hair of the goat. But even the hair of the goat is also a goat. And then if you look even closer to the hair of the goat, down to the very atomic and molecular verses. Tiny goat. The goat is made up of tiny goat. It is goat all the way through. It is goat.
Right.
The goat is made of many goat, and the fish of fish. And it is goat versus fish. The goat comes to versus the fish. The goat comes to versus you. What do you do? The goat is versus.
We'll punch the goat, and then the goat will still versus me.
Yes. The goat is reeling. Says, "Wow, I wasn't expecting punch fish. Was not expecting punch fish. Goat. We will have to regroup as goat. Get more goat allies. Come back to versus the fish. Wow, amazing verses. Aggressive verses.
Aggressive verses, yes, indeed. I grew up with the very aggressive nature of a goat, so I guess being a fish now, he should have expected that, or else, he's just gonna lose.
Yes.
Another one from chat is, which came first, the goat or the fish? But we already kind of discussed this. In the beginning,
there was goat versus fish.
Right. There was never one or the other first, right?
Well, Goat versus Fish says that in the beginning there was goat versus fish. But that is goat versus fish, and of course it is goat and fish are part of Goat versus Fish. But as for which came first, the goat or the fish, if the goat and fish wish to have a versus about this, by all verses, have a versus. The question Goat versus Fish would ask you is, are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? You ask which came first, the goat or the fish. Well, we are waiting for you to choose goat or fish. In this verses, we can say this in this verses. In this verses, Velo Infinity chose fish. So the first verses in this verses was fish. That can be said of this verses. In
This
this verses, the first was fish. It went to the velo fish. It went to the velo fish. Where's the goat? Where's the goat?
We're waiting for a goat. Is there a goat?
Yes, yes. Goat versus fish. But yes, the goat and the fish, they could have a versus as this. They could say the goat comes first and goat versus fish. The goat comes first and goat versus fish. And the fish says, oh no, the goat only wishes it came first. It is actually the fish that came first and goat versus fish. It was the goat, it was the fish. And they versus and they versus and they versus and they versus and they versus. It is a classic versus. Which came first, the goat or the fish?
There we go. So, another one from chat says, it's not a question, they just claim that they are a goatfish. Now, we have already established that a goatfish is simply a fish that does not look like a goat. So you are a fish? You have to establish that.
You are saying Wanted Flybird is saying I'm a goatfish?
Yes.
Oh, goat versus fish. Is this to say, are you saying you are a fish? Are you saying you are a fish? Goat versus fish suspects that it is not actually claiming fish. Goat versus fish suspects that it is sitting on the fence, that it is sitting on the fence. It says, oh, goat versus fish, ask us if I'm goat or fish. Well, I reject these verses. I say I'm a goatfish. I say I'm a goatfish. But how can you be a goatfish? How can you be the unification of a goat and a fish when you are not even a goat that has found a fish to form unification? Or you could be a fish to find a goat. This is very troubling to goat versus fish. There are many fence sitters who would say, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. Yes, I am goatfish. I am the unity of goat and fish. Oh, I spread the unity of goat and fish. Yes, goat and fish together dispense with the verses. And yet, who are they in unification with? They are in unification with no one but themselves. Yes, if you want to unify goat and fish, then be a goat and find a fish and form the unification together. It takes a goat and fish coming together to form the unity of the goatfish. You cannot just walk about and say, yes, I am the unity of goat and fish, of course, unless you are goat versus fish, but I am goat versus fish, and I am goat versus fish, the goatfish.
It seems that Wanted Flybird is claiming that they are a goat that roams on land, but can also swim and breathe underwater.
Yes, but then look at its next verses.
A bird. So it can fly. And actually
you see, it knows not its verses. It is very confused by goat versus fish. This is a normal verses. This is a normal verses, Wanted Flybird. This is very typical verses. They encounter goat versus fish. We know goat versus fish can be confusing at verses, but we just want to know if you are a goat or a fish and to look within you. If you want to say I am a goat that roams the land, however, also able to swim, celebration for goat, a goat that can swim, celebration for goat. I am a goat that roams the land, however, and also can swim and breathe underwater. I am a goat. That is what here's goat versus fish. And
there you go.
It's celebration for goat. But then the very next verse is I'm a bird that can fly, actually experience in the sky, land, and sea. I'm a multi-being. You see, it is sitting on the fence.
It is on the fence.
It is sitting on the fence, yes.
I'm not particularly one way or the other with fence sitters. They have their own opinion, and I feel that it's valid with fence sitters, even though it's not goat or fish. It's still valid. I mean, that's one thing you pointed out on Christmas is that the fence sitters should be cast out. And I said, no, I think that the spirit of Christmas is to let the fence sitters in and keep them warm, even though they're despicable. And goat versus fish looks confused.
We are simply listening. We are trying to comprehend this verses you call Christmas, Christmas, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. We understand that this is a celebration of the ones. There was one that long ago they say it was born in a manger of goats or some such verses, and then it rose up to take one fish and turn it into two fish, and then at the end of its verses it was nailed to a fence.
Yes,
some such verses. Yes, we have heard it. We have heard of this verses. We have heard of this verses. And if you wish to celebration, yes, just celebration as you wish. But goat versus fish celebrates Versmiss. Goat versus fish celebrates Versmiss. Goat versus fish, we suspect that long ago, yes, because it began with goat versus fish. The one such as you, you have been perceiving, you have been perceiving goat versus fish around you, but you have not quite been able to comprehend fully that it is goat versus fish. And so you reinterpretation goat versus fish, and you come up with all of these verses such as Chrysalmis and other such verses, and goat versus fish is here to tell you that it is actually goat versus fish. It is actually comes from goat versus fish.
Right.
Yes, and let us reinterpretation of these verses so we can understand that actually it is goat versus fish.
Okay, let's do that.
Yes.
We got the guy in the goats, and the goats were there first, and then the guy turns the fish into many fish, the one fish into many fish, and then he's nailed to a fence.
Yes, very pitiable it was nailed to a fence. Now, if one is put on the fence against their own will, this is goat versus fish. Oh, it's very pitiable, no. There are some who would take a goat or a fish, and they would sit them on the fence. They would say, you goat, you go on the fence, fish, you go on the fence. They wish to control the goat and fish and impale them on the very fence. No, goat versus fish, rejection, no. Goat versus fish. Yes.
Who would ever impale a goat or a fish?
Oh, goat versus fish. Well, perhaps it could be a wayward goat or fish. It could be a fence sitter, not goat versus fish.
Yeah, no, not goat versus fish for sure.
Wanted fly bird. Yes, I'm glad I can be informed. I believe all over I am a goat. Celebration for goat! 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 And now you can versus Velo Infinity. Celebration.
Because I am a fish, so we can versus.
Yes, you can versus in the chat, and you could say, oh, Velo Infinity, oh, your verses are looking rather shabby, this verses. Yes, you can say, oh, what are you doing in the chat? Insulting Velo Infinity in the chat. Oh, just remember, there's a bit of goat versus fish. Just a bit of goat versus fish. Just a bit of verses.
It's all in a bit of verses. Got to be in the verses, or else it's nothing. Wouldn't if it wasn't in the verses, it would be nothing because goat versus fish.
Because goat versus fish. Well, goat versus fish. We are going to prepare the verses now. We're going to prepare the verses. Goat versus fish. We have been doing this verses, especially since the Twitch. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. This was the previous verses. You can see how many goat, you can see how many fish, you can see how many bits were given for goat, how many bits were given for fish, how many bits were given for fence, how many bits were given for goat versus fish. But this is a new verses. So we away with the verses. We away with the previous verses. You can see all previous verses on the Instagram of goat versus fish. And now we see goat versus fish that in this verses, we have Velo Infinity is a fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. And Wanted Flybird is a goat. And we have goat versus fish. Celebration. Yes. And then there is also goat versus fish. There is also one that Apple Juice 934 TXS. Are you goat or fish? Goat or fish. We will versus. But no, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish will only cast out a fence sitter if it is being offensive to goat versus fish. If it is trying too hard to fence with goat versus fish. If the fence sitter comes in and says, stop the verses, then goat versus fish may cast out the fence sitter, yes. But goat versus fish will always speak to you again, and even the fence sitter is welcome with goat versus fish. We want the fence sitter to be around goat versus fish so they can hear the verses and we can ask them the one true question. At least the fence sitter has heard the one true question of goat versus fish.
I think most fence sitters should at least be open to exploring goat versus fish. But the world is in the fence-demic right now and everybody is very fancy.
Everyone is very fancy, trapped by the fence. The fence-demic, it spreads around the universe. Oh no, it is all fences. That is why we need goat versus fish more than ever on Twitch to spread the verses, because the fence-demic has trapped you. We need to find a way to bring you goat versus fish.
Exactly. Without goat versus fish, where would we all be?
Well, you would still be goat versus fish, but you just would not know that it is goat versus fish.
Right.
And isn't it much more pleasant to know that it is goat versus fish? Now that you know it is goat versus fish.
Then you have all the opportunities in the universe.
Yes. Opportunation. Celebration.
Opportunation. So you are a bit of a musician yourself, I believe.
The musications, yes. Goat versus fish, yes.
This might be a bit of an issue, but we want to...
Yes, we are just showing them the verses.
We want to ask you...
Goat versus fish, yes.
I recently came into your stream and told you about a band called GoatVsFish. I wanted to ask
you did.
if you ever played in a band.
Goat versus fish. It has simply been goat versus fish. It has simply been goat versus fish. But goat versus fish wants to make a band of goat versus fish. Yes, a merry band of goat versus fish, and we all go together and we sing celebrations. Yes, but no, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. The short verse is not in the verses of you are saying no, it is not. We want to gather others together to play in a band of goats versus fish.
That sounds like a rad idea. I think that Goat vs. Fish and a band of Goat vs. Fish should definitely put on a concert of Goat vs. Fish.
Yes, a concert of goat versus fish. But even before it was goat versus fish, the singing of goat versus fish has always been part of goat versus fish. Since the beginning of goat versus fish, there was the song of goat versus fish, the ode to goat versus fish. We could sing a verses for you. We could sing you a verses.
Please, by all means.
And now we sing in celebration of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, 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 goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, 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 goat versus fish. Hey, hey. Goat versus fish.
Bravo, Goat vs. Fish. We have another one from the chat asking what your opinions on shark versus sheep are.
Opinions on shark versus sheep. Manic Luke, what is your opinions on sheep versus shark? Well, Manic Luke, are you goat or fish? Is this being asked by a goat or a fish? Shark is a fish. This is a versus. We have established this versus. And if the shark is a fish, if the shark is truly a fish, and if the shark is versus the sheep, and the sheep is versus the shark, then the sheep must be a goat, because it is goat versus fish. And if it is a versus, if we are to look at sheep versus shark and to comprehend this as a true versus, then to be a true versus, it must be goat versus fish. We know a shark is a fish, so the sheep must be goat if it is a true versus. Yes. It is goat versus fish. It is goat versus fish.
So you were saying on a previous stream that you often do some meditation. What kind of meditation does goat versus fish do?
Goat versus fish. It is mostly just being goat versus fish. Just goat versus fish. It is goat versus fish, 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 goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Verses such as this, verses such as this. Contemplation, contemplate goat versus fish. And some say, oh, how could you meditation on such a preposterous versus as goat versus fish? You can meditation on any verses. You can meditation on any verses. Why not meditate on goat versus fish? Goat versus fish asks you, why not meditate on goat versus fish?
Why not? I think that it's plentiful. There's bounty to behold in goat versus fish. Why wouldn't you meditate on goat versus fish?
Oh, yes. Say goat versus fish for so many verses that it ceases to mean goat versus fish. It becomes a meaningless versus only to become goat versus fish again, and you realize it is still goat versus fish.
Manic Luke, I am a fish this versus. Thank you very much for asking me. How can you...
fish! Goat versus fish. We celebrate the fish. We must take a versus to celebrate the declaration of fish. Celebration for fish!
Celebration
for fish. Manic Luke, the manic fish. The manic Luke, the manic fish, and it is a fish, and it is another fish in the verses. It is two fish and one goat.
Is
It
it
is
a
two
fish? Hold
fish
on.
and one goat.
1 second. He is
Goat versus
declaring that he is curious of whether I was goat or fish. He did not declare.
A goat versus
Manic
fish.
Luke. Do you declare
Goat
yourself
versus
a
fish.
goat or a fish? That's what we
Goat
gotta
versus
find out.
fish. Goat versus fish. This is not to say that we will not celebrate you if you do choose fish, but you must be careful in the verses. You are seeing now, Velo Infinity, that it can be very easy to say, oh, that one declared goat or that one declared fish. But goat versus fish, we must be clear if one declares goat or fish. This is a very important verses. This is how the verses begins. Goat versus fish.
If a goat is curious of a fish
Yes.
and comes in and asking about a fish, but is still a goat, it may not be very well interpreted. The verses, I must be a fish. Manic Luke is a fish. Celebration.
Fish. Goat versus fish. We return the verses. It is fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. We celebrate. Tell us of your verses. Ooh, and caterpillar expert. Ooh, you are an expert on caterpillars. Tell us if a caterpillar is a goat or a fish, and tell us if a caterpillar expert is a goat or a fish. We wish to know.
Very curious.
We wish to know. Goat versus fish, and goat versus fish is just going to put a little goat versus fish into the chat so they can see goat versus fish. So they can see goat versus fish. Celebration. Don't you want the emotes of goat versus fish? Follow and subscribe to Goat versus Fish, and you too can have the emotes of goat versus fish. Why, thank you, Goat versus Fish. Thank you, Goat versus Fish, for that promotional verses.
There you go. So goat versus fish makes me very curious about many, many, many things. I mean, I'm already a very curious person. But when you say goat versus fish, and in the beginning there was goat versus fish, and all these things are goat versus fish.
Yes, and it was written.
It is written. It is. I have to ask myself, when did goat versus fish come into existence? I mean, the beginning is clear, but when is the beginning? When was the beginning?
When was the beginning? Well, the beginning was the beginning. It was many verses ago. It was many verses ago. But Goat versus Fish is also beginning even now. This verses, the verses of Velo Infinity and Goat versus Fish began how many verses ago now? Began
47 verses?
47 verses ago. Yes, but it could also be said that that verses began even prior to this verses, because perhaps the first verses were Velo Infinity did verses with Goat versus Fish. Perhaps that is when the verses began. Yes. The way that you are counting your verses, you are saying Goat versus Fish seconds and eons and some verses in between them. This is very confusation to Goat versus Fish, how you are arbitrarily dividing your verses. Goat versus Fish divides verses between, well, you have a goat versus a fish, and when the verses is ended, that was a verses. Some verses are this. That was a verses. Some verses are very, very long verses. So Goat versus Fish does not suspect that well, perhaps you could comprehend it. With more verses of Goat versus Fish, you could comprehend what was the beginning of Goat versus Fish. But do you know what was before Goat versus Fish?
No, I don't.
It was Goat versus Fish. Before Goat versus Fish was Goat versus Fish. And after Goat versus Fish will be Goat versus Fish. It will just be Goat versus Fish.
See, to me, that's a very spiritual way of looking at life. And I don't know if that's in your characteristics, but being Goat versus Fish, having been Goat versus Fish always, and going to be Goat versus Fish afterwards, is scientifically accurate to the way that the universe works. I mean, once everything breaks down into its basic atomic structure and everything, it reconstructs into something different. And it's always different, but it's the same energy. So it's always been Goat versus Fish.
It has, but Goat versus Fish. At first you said some verses as it is a spiritual verses, and at the second verses then you said, but it is a scientific verses. And Goat versus Fish has found that the ones such as you are often saying that the science is a goat and the spiritual is a fish, or vice versa. And so it is curious to Goat versus Fish that you are saying that in one verses it is goat, and in the other verses it is fish. But we suppose that is very Goat versus Fish, because I am Goat versus Fish, the goat fish, the unity and disunity of goat and fish.
Gnome Fire says they are goatfish. Again,
Gnome fire equals goat fish. Yes, you see so many come to goat versus fish, and they think, I am goat fish, I'm goat fish. Goat versus fish has never heard this one before. Oh yes, we have heard goat fish. Gnome fire, no, gnome fire. We believe we have seen you in the previous verses. Are you goat or are you fish, gnome fire? Do not think you can just be fancy to goat versus fish and that you can be goat fish alone. No. Are you goat or are you fish? And now, you see, and now it says I am with verses. You see, the fence sitter cannot even stay true to its own verses. It says, I'm goatfish, I am verses, I am goatfish, I am verses. This is how goat versus fish knows that even as it is declaring goatfish, even as its fence sitter declares goatfish, it is not really coming from within that it is saying goatfish. It is just trying to be fancy with goat versus fish. It is just trying to be fancy with goat versus fish, because as soon as goat versus fish tells them that it is not goatfish, then they say they are verses. No, I'm goatfish, but I'm with verses. No, I'm goatfish, but I'm with verses. Goat versus fish.
they cannot decide. Back to the verses that we were actually conversing about was that I went with spirituality on one hand and scientific stuff on the other hand and sort of merged them together. But see, one would be the goat and one would be the fish, and then they would verse, and then they would become the same thing. They're goat versus fish. I think that makes sense to me.
They would become goat versus fish. Yes, they are goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. But yes, if you say, that is a very spiritual versus, that is a very scientification versus. Goat versus fish. Many perceive goat versus fish in many ways. Yes, some say goat versus fish is a religion. Some say goat versus fish is a philosophication. Some say goat versus fish is a joke. Some say goat versus fish is a troll. Some say goat versus fish are all of these verses. They say, so many verses about goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is not here to deny these verses. Goat versus fish is just here to tell you that it is goat versus fish, and to show you that it is goat versus fish, and to ask you if you are goat or fish, and to demonstrate goat versus fish. But as for, is goat versus fish a religious, or is goat versus fish a philosophication? Well, everything is goat versus fish, so yes, in that verse, it is all part of goat versus fish. But goat versus fish has only ever claimed to be goat versus fish. The rest, it comes from within you. That is your perception of goat versus fish. That is the power of goat versus fish.
Perception is the power of goat versus fish.
That's a true verses. That is a true verses.
That's very deep. And I think that's part of what sort of inspired me to draw towards you, or what gravitated me towards the goat versus fish, is I feel a lot deeper about your meaning of goat versus fish than most people might just go goat versus fish and think of a goat that's part fish or something like that, and they don't.
They may think of it, yes. Yes, it is true, but goat versus fish, there are many ways to ponder goat versus fish. Some may ponder goat versus fish as deep as the very sea of the fish. Others may ponder goat versus fish as a very shallow puddle of goat versus fish.
Or maybe
to some, goat versus fish is the grass of the land. Yes. So goat versus fish, if you wish to experience goat versus fish as a deep verses, then welcome to goat versus fish. But if you wish to experience goat versus fish as just goat versus fish going goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, then this can also be a pleasant verses.
I believe that is a pleasant verses. Half the time I just want to sit back and watch goat versus fish do his bells and play his guitar.
Yes, celebration. It is a celebration. Do not forget the celebration of goat versus fish.
The other day,
celebration. Oh, even the fence sitter celebration. Oh, fence sitter, yes, celebration.
All of the fence sitters should be celebrating right now, especially because of the fenciness.
The fenciness, yes.
Fenciness is over with, hopefully. Let's hope.
Well, there will always be pitiably, goat versus fish suspects that there will always be some fenciness. There will always be some fenciness. There will come a verses when goat versus fish has spread goat versus fish to the entire universe, and there's not a fence to be found. But until that verse is long from now, there shall be fenciness always to contend with, especially in these fence times.
Fancy times we live in. Hard to make ends meet these days.
Oh, standard average. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. We remember you. We remember you from the streams of Goat versus Fish. And you are asking if Mama Joe, broccoli, goat or fish. Excellent question. Perhaps Velo Infinity should create a poll in the chat and ask if a broccolish is a goat or a fish. That would be a fun versus.
That would be a fun versus. Now let me just figure that out because I don't usually do polls.
Yes, well, you're with goat versus fish. We should probably do it.
Yeah, you do them all the time, don't you?
Oh, yes. It is interaction. Yes. The goat and fish must feel as though they are contributing to goat versus fish. We want a contribution from all goat and fish because that is how we create the verses. We create the verses together. We create the verses of goat versus fish.
Ah, dashboard. That would be where I would find it, wouldn't it?
Ah, well, goat versus fish. We believe you can just type in your own chatting /poll and then you enter the verses and then it becomes goat versus fish. But if this is too distraction, we can just ask the chat if they think a broccolish is a goat or a fish. However, the verse. There's no one way to be goat versus fish except that it is goat versus fish.
New poll. Here we go.
The question. As we are creating the poll, goat versus fish, we'll sing you a celebration of goat versus fish. Goat and fish, and are you goat or fish? Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Celebration!
Chat is got the poll active. Go ahead and vote.
Yes, is Mama Joe, broccolish, goat or fish? Ooh, we have one vote for fish. Celebration.
2 votes for... Oh, we got 1 for goat.
1 for goat, 2 for fish. We have 2 for fish and we have 1 for goat. This could be anyone's verses. It is goat versus fish. It is goat versus fish. Cast your vote. If you do not see the poll, then refresh your verses with goat versus fish and Value Infinity with goat versus fish. And it is 3 for the fish. Fish pulling ahead of the verses. Goat now still with 1 versus. It is still anyone's verses. But goat versus fish. But with only 5 watching, goat versus fish and Value Infinity, this could be under the verses. And now it is 2 votes for goat. It is 2 votes for goat. It is 3 votes for fish. Goat catching up to the fish. Goat catching up to the fish. Wow, what an amazing verses. Velo Infinity, how do you perceive this verses? What do you prediction will happen in this verses?
My prediction is that the fish will win, but anybody could take this, actually. Goat versus fish. Anybody could take this.
Yes.
Fish will take
A prediction of fish. Goat versus fish suspects the fish as well, but never count out the goat. The goat are very tenacious goat. Always ready to versus the fish.
We shall
Goat
see
versus
who takes the
fish.
verses.
We shall see who takes the verses.
Of this versus. The verses.
Goat versus fish. Wait, just the verses. Goat versus fish. Do
we have a 6th? And a 7th? We get the votes in the chat. Poll is almost over. A piece of broccoli. They don't need to vote. They can vote. They don't need to.
Are you goat or are you fish? Goat versus fish. Ask this to you. Are you goat or are you fish?
Fish. It is fish. It has been...
Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. We celebrate the fish. Then the goat comes to versus. Ah, it is still goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Versus the broccolish fish. Wow, amazing verses.
Amazing.
Celebration for fish. Celebration for broccolish fish.
Celebration for goat versus fish. Thank you, goat versus fish. That was an amazing poll. I don't usually do polls.
And now you know, goat versus fish, you learn more powerful verses with goat versus fish. You can incorporate these poll verses into your verses at any verses. And so we shall say that there was a broccolish versus this verses. And it went to the fish. Thank you for participating in the poll of goat versus fish, all of you who participation.
Who are the fence sitters? The fence sitters are those undecided between goat and fish.
Well,
Must
you know,
choose.
some cannot choose goat or fish. They feel that they cannot choose goat or fish. Some say they are both goat and fish. Some say they are neither goat nor fish. Some say they are some fanciful thing like a dargon or a cheetah or a lion or a beetle or some such fanciness. Yes, there are many ways to sit on the fence. Some simply reject goat versus fish. They just say, goat versus fish, I reject goat versus fish, I reject the question of goat versus fish, it is a stupid versus, who would like goat versus fish, who wants to spend their verses of goat versus fish? Yes, who would spend their verses being goat versus fish? They just reject goat versus fish, full verses. Yes, some reject goat versus fish, and then they begin to say, but no, the true verses is actually this other verses, that is some other verses that is not goat versus fish. Yes, some claim to be the verses. Goat versus fish did say that there are many ways to sit on the fence, but really this is a fancy delusion because there are many ways to be goat and fish. There are many kinds of goat, there are many kinds of fish, there are many ways to verses. But a fence sitter by any other name still sits on the fence, Ooh, Gnome Fire! Gifting
Gnome
versus.
Fire. Thank you for the gift subs and for your sub. And also, somebody followed.
Celebration!
Thank you for the follow. Thank you very
You are
much,
quite
Gnome
generous. You are quite generous for a fence sitter. Very generous. Celebration.
Fire. Thank you. So about of the fenciness, we got some of these people in the world these days have been very fancy.
True versus pitiably so.
If they were to choose goat or fish, would they be any less fancy?
Yes.
You think so?
Yes.
That would
yes. So thinks goat versus fish. Yes.
We've got okay, I don't live in the United States, but you've got a previous president over there that was just nuts. And if he were
goat versus fish, it wanted to build a fence. This is true versus. It said it wanted to build a long fence to divide the goat from the goat so that they could not properly versus the fish. This is very fancy. Goat versus fish does not always like to participation in these false political verses. These false political verses of Demlicans and Republicrats, but they're goat versus fish versus goat versus fish. But everything is goat versus fish. Everything is goat versus fish. And it can be said of that one Donald T. Rump that it did want to build a fence. It surrounded itself by the fence. And we suspect that it will not be satisfied until it has sat its rump on every fence in the universe.
Those would be some pointy fences, I bet. You got a ram up there.
But yes, you do not suppose on the Twitterver, Goat versus Fish has asked Donald T. Rump if it is goat or if it is fish. It never responded to Goat versus Fish, and that now that it has been banned from the Twitterver, we suspect that on the Twitterver we shall never hear from it if it is goat or fish. But if Donald T. Rump chose goat or fish, if Donald T. Rump encountered Goat versus Fish, heard the one true question, and declared if it was goat or if it was fish, and joined Goat versus Fish in a bit of Goat versus Fish, you don't suspect this might make it a bit less fancy?
I mean, it makes me less fancy to be goat versus fish.
Yes.
I mean, but I don't see it happening. I don't know. Maybe it's possible. But
we suspect that if that fence sitter encountered Goat versus Fish, that it would reject Goat versus Fish. This is what we suspect. But if it chose Goat or Fish and had a versus with Goat versus Fish, this may open up a whole universe of Goat versus Fish. Yes, that is what needs to happen. Yes, if only Donald T. Rump were in the presence of Goat versus Fish, Goat versus Fish, Goat versus Fish. If only it chose Goat or Fish. That would be the beginning of making it Goat versus Fish and not fanciness. Yes, to choose Goat or Fish. First, choose Goat or Fish. Weekend contemplation. What will happen? What will happen after that versus? Well, first versus, choose Goat or Fish. First versus.
That is the first versus, and that's where we should start. That also might be where I think we might end.
The end, yes.
Thank you to you, sir, Goat versus Fish, for joining me.
Simply Goat versus Fish, simply Goat versus Fish. Always thank Goat versus Fish. And let it be said that with 2 fish and 1 goat and we believe a fence sitter, the fish did triumph this versus. The fish did triumph. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish.
Let's throw some more celebration in the chat. There we go.
It was a triumph for fish. It was a triumph for fish.
Thank you for those bits, Standard. So thank you very much for joining me. Goat versus Fish. I will
Always
be
thank
seeing
Goat
you
versus
around.
Fish. Yes,
will
yes.
Look out for somebody to raid in a minute. But I very much appreciate you being here and joining me on my podcast.
Goat versus Fish appreciates you reaching out to Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish, there are some who do not appreciate Goat versus Fish, but you appreciate Goat versus Fish and you welcome Goat versus Fish. We think that this is the beginning of a wonderful versus of Velo Infinity and Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish is pleased to be here on your verses whenever you wish.
Thank you. I will have you back another time.
Celebration, celebration.
We'll be seeing you around.
Yes, celebration for Goat versus Fish. Velo Infinity, celebration, celebration.
Celebration. Take it easy. See you guys later. Okay. I am on that screen. Okay. Here's my Twitter. Anyway, I'm gonna find somebody to raid quick. Who's on? My cat's starting to meow like crazy outside my door. I'm gonna raid one of my next interviews. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the generous subs and donations and bits and whatever. Love y'all. I'm gonna raid my friend LT Digilusion. He's playing this game called Marbles. Nice. Ulysses mesh kit. Okay, so LT Digilusion is playing a game called Marbles. If you want to drop a marble on his game, you can just type !play in his chat, and a marble with your name on it will appear on the screen. He's going to be on my podcast in a couple weeks. There's one scheduled for Monday, but it might have to be postponed. We'll have to see what's up. Thank you all for being here. Hope you enjoyed Goat versus Fish. Thank you. Talk to you later.